The mansion was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that money buys but no heart survives. Charles Wilson sat in his study, the hum of the fireplace the only proof the world hadn't stopped with him. It had been 3 years since he'd buried his son. 3 years of pretending the universe owed him nothing, and he owed it even less. And then, one afternoon, when the sky outside was the color of old silver, a sound cut through the stillness. A cry, soft, trembling, human. At first he thought he'd imagined it, a memory echoing from a room that no longer existed, but then it came again, not sorrowful, but sharp, desperate. He stood slowly, each step down the long marble hallway, carrying a weight he couldn't name. The sound grew louder, not sorrowful, but alive, pleading. He followed it to the servants' quarters, a place he hadn't entered in years. The door at the end was cracked open, light spilling out like an apology. Inside, a young woman knelt on the floor, her hands trembling, as she held a child close to her chest. The boy couldn't have been more than 3, tiny, pale, his legs bound in braces too heavy for his small frame. Tears streaked his cheeks, and the woman, her blue uniform slightly faded, yellow gloves still on, rocked him softly, whispering words in Spanish he didn't understand. For a moment, Charles couldn't move. The scene hit him like a memory that didn't belong to him. The image of love he'd lost, replayed by strangers under his roof. He took a breath, the kind that hurts on the way out, and felt something shift deep inside. Maybe stories like this existed to remind us that behind wealth and walls, hearts still break the same. Maybe there was still time to feel something again. "What is going on here?" he demanded. The woman gasped. The child flinched. She turned, her face flushed with fear, dark hair clinging to her cheek. "Mr. Wilson, please." He raised a hand. "Why is there a child in my house?" Her voice cracked. "He's my son, sir. I couldn't leave him alone. He's sick." "You brought a sick child into my home?" His tone was cold, but inside, the words scraped something raw. "He has no one else," she said softly. He looked again at the boy, the braces, the fragile frame, the courage in those brown eyes. Something flickered, recognition, pity, pain, but pride came first. "You're finished here," he said sharply. "Pack your things." Her breath caught. "Please, sir, just one night. He has a fever." I said out. She didn't. "Beg again." She gathered the blanket, lifted the boy, and whispered, "We'll go, Mateo." The name followed Charles down the hallway long after the door closed. Mateo, a name that meant gift. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he couldn't forget it. The night came down heavy and restless. Charles couldn't sleep. The house was silent again, but not the same silence. It was different now, heavier, almost alive. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the woman's face, the way her hands trembled while holding the boy, the fear, the love, the name that still echoed in his mind, Mateo. He poured himself another drink, staring at the amber reflection in the glass. Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, a rhythm that reminded him of hospital monitors long ago. And then, just when he was starting to drift into that grey space between exhaustion and regret, the sound came again. Not a cry this time. A cough, weak, gasping, suffocating. He froze. The same hallway. The same light leaking from the servants' corridor. He set his glass down and followed the sound. When he reached the door, he didn't knock. Elena, he knew her name now, was crouched beside the bed, pressing a wet cloth against her son's forehead. The boy's face burned with fever. His breath came in small, shallow bursts like a candle trying to stay lit in a storm. Charles stepped inside without speaking. Elena looked up, startled. "Please, sir, he's just tired. It will pass." But Charles could see it. Wouldn't. He had seen that look before, in another hospital, under brighter lights and colder hands. He crouched down beside her, his voice lower than he expected. "How long has he been like this?" "Since morning," she whispered. "It gets worse when he's scared. The doctor said he needs medicine, but—" She stopped. Shame finished the sentence for her. Charles looked at the cracked thermometer on the nightstand, the towel soaked in lukewarm water, the desperation in her eyes. Money could buy comfort, but it couldn't buy compassion, not the kind this woman carried trembling inside her chest. He reached for his phone. "I'm calling my doctor." Elena shook her head quickly. "No, please. They'll fire me. They'll take him away." "No one's taking him anywhere," he said, more sharply than intended. The boy whimpered, his small fingers clutching his mother's sleeve. Charles hesitated. Then, carefully, he touched the child's shoulder. "Easy," he murmured. "You're safe." The words left his mouth before his mind could stop them. The boy opened his eyes, dark, glassy, filled with confusion and fear, and for a second, Charles saw another face superimposed over his. Ethan, his own son, 3 years old, smiling through the haze of fever. Something inside him cracked. He stood abruptly, turned toward the door, then stopped. "Get ready," he said quietly. "We're going to the hospital." Elena's voice trembled. "I can't pay." He met her eyes. "I didn't ask you to." For a long moment, she just stared at him, searching for mockery, cruelty, a trap, but there was none, only the raw, uncertain mercy of a man who didn't yet know why he cared. She nodded once. "Yes, sir." Half an hour later, the car cut through the rain, headlights slicing the darkness. In the back seat, Elena cradled her son, whispering softly in his ear. Charles drove faster than he should have, his jaw set, the steering wheel trembling under his hands. When they reached St. Mary's Hospital, the same place that had taken Ethan, the memories hit him so hard he nearly turned back. But the boy coughed again, and that sound pushed him forward. The nurses rushed them inside. "Pediatric emergency," Charles said quickly. "Now." Elena clung to Mateo's hand as they wheeled him away. Charles watched from the doorway, and in that sterile light, surrounded by the same smell of antiseptic and fear, he whispered to himself, "Not again. Please, not again. Hospitals at night don't belong to the living. They belong to whispers, to memories that refuse to die." Charles walked through the automatic doors of St. Mary's and felt the air change. The smell of antiseptic hit him first. Sharp, cold, sterile. Then the sound, the low hum of machines, the click of rubber soles, the faint rhythm of heart monitors. He'd been here before. Not in this room, maybe, but in this grief. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he followed Elena down the corridor. Her hand never left her son's small arm. The child's. Eyes were half closed, his head heavy against her shoulder. When they reached the emergency room, a nurse stopped them. "Only the mother can come in." Charles hesitated. Elena turned to him, terrified. "Please, wait for me," she said, as if he might vanish and leave her to face this alone. He nodded. "I'll be right here." She disappeared behind the doors. And suddenly, he was standing in the same hallway where, 3 years earlier, he'd watched another door close, the one that had kept him from Ethan's last breath. He pressed a hand against the wall, cold, his mind filled with images he'd buried under marble and whiskey, a child's cough, a doctor shaking his head, a white sheet being pulled up too soon. He shut his eyes, fighting the tremor in his chest. Minutes crawled by like hours. When the doors finally opened, Elena came out, her face pale, her hands trembling. "They said he's stable for now," she whispered. "But his lungs, they're weak." Charles exhaled, the tension breaking, just enough for guilt to flood in. "This is my fault," he said quietly. "I should have helped sooner." Elena shook her head. "No, sir. You've already done more than anyone." But her eyes said something else, gratitude mixed with a fear she didn't have words for. They sat together in the waiting area, the room lit by the bluish glow of vending machines. A clock ticked above them, loud and merciless. Elena leaned forward, hands clasped, whispering prayers in Spanish. Charles stared at her, at the fragile strength in that posture, at the exhaustion painted across her face. "You shouldn't have to fight this alone," he said at last. She looked up. "We all fight alone, Mr. Wilson. Some of us just get used to it." The honesty in her voice struck him harder than pity ever could. He wanted to say something, to apologize, to promise, to explain, but the words never came. Hours passed. A nurse appeared. You can see him now. They entered the room together. Matteo lay small and still under the white sheets, his tiny hand attached to an IV line. The beeping of the monitor matched his heartbeat. Fragile, steady, alive. Elena sat beside him immediately, brushing the boy's hair away from his forehead. Charles stayed near the door, watching. A man who once owned the world and now didn't know what to do with his hands. He moved closer, step by step. Will he be all right? The nurse nodded softly. We'll keep him overnight for observation. Charles turned back toward Elena. Her lips moved silently, praying again. And in that moment he felt something he hadn't felt since Ethan. Humility. He pulled up a chair beside her. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The hum of the monitors filled the silence, wrapping them both in something that wasn't quite comfort, but wasn't loneliness either. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city slept. And in that small, sterile room, 3 souls who had nothing left began to share the one thing still possible, the slow, painful beginning of healing. When dawn broke over St. Mary's, the light that crept through the blinds felt too soft for a place that had seen so much pain. The rain had stopped, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and wet earth, a strange mixture of sorrow and renewal. Elena was still by Matteo's side, her head resting on the edge of the hospital bed. Her dark hair had loosened from its bun, framing a face that looked both exhausted and eternal, the kind of face carved by love, not vanity. Her hands never left her son's small arm, as if her touch alone kept him tethered to this world. Charles sat in the chair by the window, a paper cup of coffee untouched in his hand. He'd been awake all night watching them, not out of pity, out of something deeper, something he didn't have a name for. Every few minutes the monitor beeped, a steady, rhythmic sound that reminded him of Ethan's last night. But this one kept going, alive, hopeful, defiant. When Matteo stirred, Charles looked up. The boy's eyes fluttered open, soft brown eyes that seemed to carry more questions than any child should. "Where am I?" he asked weakly. Elena sat up immediately. "You're safe, mi amor. You're in the hospital. The nice doctor helped you." The boy blinked. "Are we going home?" "Soon," she said gently. "Rest now." He nodded, but his gaze drifted to Charles, who stood near the window, arms folded. The boy studied him quietly. "Who's that man?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated. "That's Mr. Wilson. He works where Mommy works." Matteo smiled faintly. He looked sad. Charles turned away before they could see the emotion in his eyes. Children always saw more than adults wanted them to. A few hours later, Eleanor stepped out to speak with the nurse, leaving Charles alone with the sleeping child. The boy's breathing was shallow but calm now, his little fingers gripping the toy car he refused to let go of. Charles found himself sitting down again, unable to stand for long. He looked at the child, the delicate lines of his face, the slight frown that stayed even in sleep, as if life had already asked too much of him. He whispered, almost to himself, "You're stronger than you look, kid." The boy didn't answer, but his fingers twitched, the small, unconscious motion of someone who's been loved enough to recognize kindness when it finds them. In the hallway, Elena spoke softly with the nurse, unaware that Charles was listening from behind the door. "I don't have insurance," she admitted, "but I'll work extra hours. I'll clean the offices, the garden, anything." The nurse smiled sadly. Someone already covered everything. Elena froze. "What?" "Mr. Wilson, he paid the full amount." For a long moment, Elena didn't move. Her eyes filled, not just with gratitude, but with confusion, as if she couldn't understand why someone like him would do something like that. She turned slowly, and through the small glass window on the door, she saw him, sitting beside her son, quiet, watching the monitors blink like tiny stars. By noon, the doctor said Matteo could go home in a day or two. Elena thanked him with a voice too small for what she felt. Charles only nodded. When they left the hospital room to grab a cup of coffee, she finally spoke. "I'll pay you back." He looked at her. "You don't have to." Her eyes met his. Please, sir, don't take my dignity. It's all I have. That hit him harder than any accusation. He didn't argue again. That night, when he returned home alone, the house no longer felt silent. It felt empty. The ticking clock, the echo of his footsteps, the smell of whiskey, all the things that used to comfort him now pressed down like ghosts. He walked to the piano in the corner of the living room. Ethan's piano. He hadn't touched it in 3 years. His fingers hovered over the keys. Then quietly, he played the same lullaby his wife used to hum to their son, a melody made of longing and love. And somewhere between the notes, he realized what scared him most. For the first time since his child's death, he wanted someone to live. By the time they left the hospital, the sky had turned grey again. Not the kind of grey that promised storms, but the kind that carried secrets. Charles held the door open as Elena wheeled Matteo out, her eyes still swollen from too many sleepless nights. The boy clutched his toy car, the same one he had held through fevers and tears. He smiled when the rain touched his face. "It's warm," he said softly. Elena brushed a strand of wet hair from his forehead. "That's because the world missed you." Charles stood beside them, silent, watching the scene unfold like something fragile, something he had no right to touch. He cleared his throat. "I'll have my driver take you home." Elena looked up. "We can take the bus, sir. You've already done enough." He frowned. "It's not a request." For a moment she wanted to protest, to protect the small border of independence she still had. But Matteo's tired eyes ended the argument. She nodded. "Thank you." The ride back was quiet. Elena sat in the back seat holding her son, whispering stories about angels who fixed broken legs and taught children to walk again. Charles sat across from them, pretending to check his phone, but every word she spoke sank into him like a prayer. When they reached the small apartment building on the outskirts of the city, she thanked him again and stepped out. The rain was falling harder now, drumming softly on the hood of the car. Charles watched her struggle with the wheelchair, one hand holding an umbrella, the other guiding the boy through puddles. Something inside him rebelled at the sight. He stepped out, ignoring the driver's protests, and took the umbrella from her hand. "I'll help." She froze. "You don't need to." "I know," he said simply. Together they lifted the boy up the narrow stairs. The apartment was small, too small, but it was alive. A faded rug, a cracked photo frame, drawings on the wall in bright colors. It smelled like detergent and love. Charles looked around as Elena helped Matteo settle into bed. The room was dimly lit but warm. On the nightstand sat an old picture of a man, younger, darker skin, kind eyes. "Your husband?" Charles asked quietly. Elena hesitated. "He left before Matteo was born." "I'm sorry." She smiled faintly. "Don't be. Sometimes leaving is the only thing people know how to do." He nodded, his throat tightening. He understood that more than she could ever know. When she returned from the kitchen with tea, he was standing by the window watching the rain. She handed him a cup. "You don't have to stay." "I know," he said again, softly, "but I will." The warmth of the cup lingered in his hands, though he didn't drink. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was the kind that said two broken people had accidentally found the same room. Eleanor finally spoke. "You must think I'm weak." He turned to her. "I think you're stronger than anyone I've met." Her eyes filled for just a moment before she looked away. "Strong doesn't keep the lights on." He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and placed a folded envelope on the table. "Rent for the next 6 months," he said quietly. She stared at it like it was a snake. "I can't take that." "Yes, you can. It's not charity." "Then what is it?" He paused. "A debt to someone I couldn't save." She didn't ask what he meant. Some truths don't need to be spoken. They hang in the air, understood by the kind of silence only grief knows. When he left, the rain had softened again, almost forgiving. From the car window, he saw them through the glass, mother and child, the boy asleep, the woman sitting beside him, whispering one last prayer before closing her eyes. For the first time in years, Charles Wilson didn't drive back to a mansion. He drove back to a memory he thought he'd buried, and to a question he couldn't silence. Why does that boy feel like someone I've already lost? Sleep didn't visit Charles that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the rain outside whispering against the windows like ghosts asking to be let in. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw two faces, one he'd buried and one still fighting to live. Ethan, Mateo. Two names, two worlds, colliding somewhere inside his chest. At 3:14 a.m., he gave up trying to sleep and walked to the piano room. He hadn't turned on the lights in there for years. The faint city glow crept through the curtains, enough to show the outline of the old piano, the same one Ethan had loved to pound with sticky little hands. He sat down and played a single note. It echoed in the dark, haunting and hollow, then another and another, until, without realizing, he was playing the lullaby again, the one his wife had written for their son when he was born. Each note cracked open something inside him. By the time he reached the final chord, tears were sliding down his face in silence. He whispered into the empty room, "Why him, not you?" But the walls didn't answer. They never did. The next morning, he drove to work, but didn't go inside. His office tower reflected in the rain-slick street, cold and tall, a monument to a man who'd forgotten how to feel. Instead, he found himself driving back towards St. Mary's Hospital. He parked outside, not sure what he was doing there. Through the glass doors, he could see parents in waiting rooms, nurses rushing past, a janitor mopping the same floor he had once paced in grief. He walked inside. The smell hit him again, disinfectant and memory. He made his way to the children's wing, where soft murals of animals tried to disguise the sadness that lived there. A nurse recognized him. "Mr. Wilson," she said. "You were here last night, right, with Mrs. Morales and her son?" He nodded. "She's back for a follow-up. Room 214. He hesitated. The same number. Ethan's old room. For a moment he couldn't breathe. The hospital lights seemed to blur, but he went. Elena looked up when he entered. She was sitting by Mateo's bed again, sunlight falling across her face. The boy was awake, playing quietly with his toy car, humming to himself. "Mr. Wilson," she said softly, "I didn't expect you. I didn't expect me either," he admitted. Mateo grinned faintly. "Hi again?" Charles smiled. "Hi, champ. Feeling better?" The boy nodded. "Mom says I'm strong. Are you strong too?" Charles blinked. No one had asked him that in years. He smiled, without answering. Trying to be. Elena watched the exchange carefully, her eyes filled with something she didn't want to name, a blend of gratitude and fear. When Charles turned to leave, she stopped him. "Wait," he turned back. "You didn't have to come," she said, "or pay for anything, or care. I didn't plan to," he said honestly, "but I heard his cough again last night. In my head, it wouldn't stop." She lowered her eyes. "You lost someone, didn't you?" The air between them froze. He nodded slowly. "A son." Her breath caught. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said. "I used to think grief ended when the crying stopped. Turns out it just learns to whisper." Eleanor's eyes filled with quiet tears. She looked at her child, the same age, the same fragility, and for the first time she saw him not as a rich man, but as another parent still haunted by love. Before leaving, Charles knelt beside Mateo's bed again. "You take care of your mom, okay?" Mateo smiled sleepily. "You talk like my dad." Charles froze. Elena's hand tightened on the blanket, eyes wide. He forced a smile. "Then he must be a good man." The boy nodded. "Mom says he's in heaven." Charles looked away. "Then maybe he's the one keeping you safe." When he finally stepped out of the room, his reflection in the glass door looked back at him like a stranger. And for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't sure if the ghost that haunted him was gone, or if it had just found a new body to live in. A week passed. Then, another. Charles told himself he was only checking in to make sure the child had recovered, that it was a matter of conscience, not emotion. But the truth was simpler. He missed them. He started showing up at the hospital again, under the pretext of delivering paperwork or checking the bills. Each time, Mateo's face would light up, and each time, something inside Charles, something long frozen, began to thaw. "Mr. Wilson!" Mateo's little voice rang out when he saw him. The boy was sitting up, now crayons scattered on his lap, drawing shaky stick figures on hospital paper. Charles smiled, trying to sound casual. "You're looking stronger." "I'm drawing us," the boy said proudly, holding up the paper. 3 stick figures, one tall, one small, and one with long hair in a blue dress. Charles laughed softly. "That's quite the resemblance." Eleanor, folding sheets beside the bed, smiled nervously. "He doesn't stop drawing now. It's how he heals. He's got talent," Charles said, crouching beside the boy. "What's this one?" "That's my mom." "And that one?" Mateo looked at him, eyes wide and innocent. "That's you." Charles froze. "Me?" The boy nodded. "You were there when I was sick. Mom said angels visit when we pray really hard, but I think you're real." Eleanor's face turned pink. "Mateo, don't bother Mr. Wilson." But Charles couldn't look away from the child's drawing. 3 figures holding hands, something he hadn't seen or allowed himself to imagine since Ethan. He placed a hand gently on the boy's hair. "You're a brave kid, Mateo." "I'm brave because Mommy says God gave me 2 dads," the boy said. "One in heaven and one who drives cars really fast." The words hit Charles like lightning, the kind that burns but also lights everything it touches. After that, the visits became routine. He'd stop by with small gifts, books, puzzles, crayons, things he told himself were for the boy, not for himself. Eleanor tried to protest at first. "You don't need to." "I know," he'd interrupt, "but I want to." Sometimes they'd talk, sometimes they'd sit in silence, both watching the boy sleep. One evening, while the sun painted the hospital walls orange, Eleanor finally asked, "Why do you keep coming back?" He looked at her, uncertain whether she wanted an answer or an excuse. "I'm not sure," he said. "Maybe I like the sound of someone breathing who still believes in miracles." Eleanor didn't reply, but her eyes softened. That night, Charles dreamt of Ethan. In the dream, his son was standing in the same hospital corridor, holding a toy car, but when he turned, it wasn't Ethan's face anymore. It was Mateo's. "Dad," the boy whispered, "don't be late this time." Charles woke up drenched in sweat, his chest heavy, his pulse racing. He got up, walked to the window, and whispered into the night, "I won't." The next morning, he called the hospital. He offered to cover Mateo's long-term therapy and medication anonymously. When the nurse asked if he was a relative, he paused, then said quietly, "Something like that." That evening, he found himself driving not to his mansion, but to a small bakery near Eleanor's apartment. He bought bread, pastries and milk, things he hadn't done for anyone in years, and carried the bags up the narrow stairs. When Elena opened the door, surprise flickered across her face. "Mr. Wilson, what are you doing here?" "Just bringing some things," he said. "For Mateo." She stared at him, speechless for a moment. "You don't even know what kind of milk he likes." He smiled faintly. "Then you'll have to tell me." That night, when he left, the boy was asleep, and Elena stood at the door holding the bag he'd brought. "Why are you being kind to us?" she asked softly. He thought for a long moment before answering. "Because once, someone was kind to me, and I didn't know how to thank them." She nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "Then thank them through us." Charles smiled, a real one this time. "Maybe that's exactly what I'm trying to do." A week later, Eleanor stood at the hospital's discharge desk, signing the final papers. Mateo was smiling again, his cheeks full of color. The doctors called it a recovery. Charles called it a miracle. When they stepped outside, a black car was waiting. The driver held the door open. Elena frowned. "Sir, you've done more than enough." Charles shook his head. "You'll come stay at the mansion for a few days. The boy needs quiet, clean air, and someone should watch over him until he's stronger." Her grip tightened on the handle of the wheelchair. "People like me don't belong in houses like yours." He looked at her then, and for once his voice carried no authority, only gentleness. "Maybe I don't either." She hesitated. The wind picked up and Mateo coughed softly. That sound decided for her. "Just a few days," she whispered. The mansion looked different when they arrived. Not as vast, not as cold. The marble floors no longer gleamed with perfection. They reflected the movement of life again. A nurse's bed was set up in the guest wing, sunlight streaming across the linens. "Is this heaven?" Matteo asked as Charles carried him inside. "Not quite," Charles replied with a smile, "but we'll make it close." Elena touched the doorframe like someone crossing into sacred ground. Every step echoed softly, like the house was learning new sounds, breathing, whispering, hope. That night, the rain returned, tapping gently against the tall windows. Charles found himself standing in the hallway outside their room. Through the slightly open door, he could see them. Elena reading quietly, Matteo asleep beside her. The lamp's golden light turned everything tender. His mansion, once a place of absence, was full again. He watched as Elena brushed her son's hair back and hummed a lullaby. It was the same tune he had played on his piano nights before. He froze. The melody floated through the air, fragile, perfect, haunting. When she finished, he whispered without meaning to, "Where did you learn that song?" Elena looked up, startled. "I don't know. My grandmother used to sing it. She said she heard it from a nurse who once worked here, many years ago." Charles felt his blood run cold. His wife had written that song. No one outside his family should have known it. He stepped closer to the door, but before he could speak, Matteo stirred and muttered, "Night, Dad." Elena froze. Matteo. But Charles only smiled faintly. Let him dream. Over the next few days, the mansion changed. The sound of laughter replaced silence. Fresh flowers appeared on the dining table. The staff, once afraid to speak above a whisper, found themselves smiling again. Charles spent his mornings reading in the study while Elena cooked breakfast in the kitchen. She insisted on working to repay him, though her cooking was nothing short of gratitude turned into flavor. At first, they barely spoke, but slowly, small exchanges grew into conversations. "You don't like tea?" she asked one morning. "I used to," he replied. "My wife did too." "What happened?" "She died, along with everything I understood about love." Eleanor's hand paused over the cup. Maybe love didn't die. Maybe it just waited. Their eyes met for a moment too long, and both looked away. That afternoon, Charles walked through the garden with Matteo, showing him the koi pond and the roses that had been neglected for years. The boy leaned forward in his wheelchair, eyes wide with wonder. "They're beautiful. Your mom will like them," Charles said. "She likes yellow ones," Matteo said quickly. "She says they smell like sunlight." He smiled. "Then I'll plant more." The boy giggled, his laughter carrying through the garden like wind through leaves. And for a moment, Charles forgot everything. The wealth, the grief, the world. There was only that sound. But when he looked down again, the boy was staring at him seriously. "Mr. Wilson?" "Yes, Matteo?" "Why are you sad when you smile?" Charles blinked. The question sliced through him like truth wearing a child's voice. "I guess I forgot how to be happy," he said. "Then I'll remind you," the boy said softly. That night, when Elena tucked her son into bed, she stood by the doorway watching Charles walk away down the hall. Two shadows stretched across the floor, his tall and steady, hers slender and hesitant, meeting in the middle of the corridor before fading into one. And for the first time since stepping into that mansion, Eleanor realized something terrifying. The longer she stayed, the harder it would be to leave. That night, the mansion felt different. The lights glowed softer, the walls breathed warmer air, and yet Charles couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen had followed him from the past. The boy's laughter from earlier still lingered in the halls, like music he couldn't stop hearing. It was a sound he hadn't known how much he missed until it came from another child's mouth. He poured a drink, but didn't taste it. The rain began again, steady and rhythmic. Every drop against the windows sounded like footsteps. Every shadow looked like someone leaving. He told himself he wouldn't dream again. He was wrong. In the dream, he was standing in the same hallway of the hospital. White walls, soft beeping, the smell of antiseptic. But instead of emptiness, he heard a child's voice calling through the corridor. "Dad, where are you?" He turned, heart pounding. "Ethan!" A small figure appeared at the far end of the hallway. The light was too bright to see his face. "Dad, hurry!" The voice called again, clearer this time, and when the figure stepped into the light, it wasn't Ethan standing there. It was Matteo. The boy's eyes were brown and full of fear. "You're late again," he whispered. Then the lights began to flicker. The sound of hospital monitors grew louder, faster, urgent. "Wait!" Charles shouted, but his voice didn't work. His feet wouldn't move. Matteo reached out a hand, his small fingers trembling. "Don't let me go like you did him." And then everything went black. Charles woke up drenched in sweat, gasping. The storm outside had grown wild. Thunder rattled the windows, lightning flashing across the ceiling like angry ghosts. He stumbled out of bed and walked toward the hallway, the same one from his dream. At the far end, a light was on. He followed it, half awake, half haunted. The sound of quiet sobbing came from inside the guest room. He opened the door gently. Elena was sitting beside Matteo's bed, holding his hand. The boy was crying softly, the remnants of a nightmare in his small, shaking body. "I'm here, mi amor," she whispered. "You're safe." Charles stepped closer. "Nightmare?" Elena looked up, startled. "I didn't hear you." He nodded toward the boy. "Bad dream?" She nodded, eyes tired. "He said he dreamed of someone calling him." "Who?" Her voice faltered. "He said, a boy." Charles sat on the edge of the bed. "It's over now, champ. You're okay." Matteo blinked up at him, still trembling. "Are you sure, Mr. Wilson? He said he knew you." The words froze him where he sat. He forced a smile. Dreams say strange things sometimes. Elena brushed her son's hair back, humming the same lullaby again. The sound wrapped around the room like a prayer. Charles stood, unable to stay still. He walked to the window and stared out into the storm. The reflection staring back at him in the glass looked like two men, one living, one gone, trapped inside the same face. He whispered to his own, "Reflection, if this is punishment, I deserve it." Behind him, the boy's breathing slowed, sleep returning. Elena leaned her head against the pillow, exhaustion pulling her down. Charles stayed by the window until the storm began to fade, and when the first pale light of dawn crept into the room, he realized something that terrified him more than grief ever had. He was starting to love the boy, not as a ghost, not as a replacement, but as if fate had handed him a second chance he didn't deserve. Morning broke clear for the first time in weeks. The rain had finally stopped, and the sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the mansion as if the sky itself wanted to begin again. But for Charles, there was no peace in it. He hadn't slept after the dream, after the storm, after hearing Matteo's voice echo Ethan's words like a ghost resurrected. When he entered the dining room, Eleanor was already there, feeding her son. The boy smiled when he saw him. "Morning, Mr. Wilson." Charles tried to smile back, but his voice was heavy. "Morning, champ. How's your leg today?" "Still heavy," Matteo said, looking down at the braces around his knees. "But Mum says I'll walk one day." Charles looked at Elena. "Has he been checked recently?" Elena hesitated. "The hospital ran tests, but there's a specialist who treated him once, before we came here. He said Matteo's muscles might grow stronger, but we'd need therapy." "Then we'll go," Charles said without hesitation. Elena blinked. "We?" He met her eyes. "Yes, I'm coming." The car ride to the children's rehabilitation clinic was quiet. Elena sat in the back with Matteo, pointing out clouds and birds through the window. Charles watched them through the rearview mirror, the reflection of a family that wasn't his, but felt like it had always been. When they arrived, the clinic smelled of disinfectant and soft hope. Walls painted with bright colors, laughter echoing in the distance, and the faint squeak of wheelchairs. Rolling down polished floors, the doctor greeted them warmly. "Mrs. Morales," he said, shaking Elena's hand, then turning to Charles. "And you must be Mr. Wilson," Charles replied. "A friend." The doctor nodded. "Good. Matteo could use more friends like you." He examined the boy carefully, running tests, measuring reflexes, watching how the braces fit. Then he frowned. "Interesting. Elena's hands tightened on her lap. "What's wrong?" The doctor shook his head slowly. "Nothing wrong. Quite the opposite. I'm surprised." Charles leaned forward. "Explain." Matteo's response is unusual. His muscle tissue is healing faster than expected, much faster than what we'd anticipate for his condition. "That's good, isn't it?" Elena asked. "Yes, very good, but that's not all." He turned to his desk, flipping through old files. "When Matteo was admitted the first time, years ago, we ran full genetic panels. There's a rare blood marker, almost never seen. I've only encountered it once before." "Actually?" Charles's brow furrowed. "Once? Where?" The doctor looked up. "In another child, years ago, at St. Mary's Hospital." Charles's stomach dropped. "St. Mary's? Ethan's hospital." He tried to sound calm. "What kind of marker?" "It's a recessive genetic trait, harmless but extremely rare. Statistically, 1 in several million children carry it. If 2 unrelated children had it, well, the odds are nearly impossible." Eleanor's face went pale. Charles's heart pounded so loud he could hear it. The doctor flipped through Matteo's file again, oblivious to the storm he had unleashed. "It's fascinating, really. I even checked the registry to confirm. The previous case belonged to a boy named Ethan Wilson." Eleanor stood up suddenly. "I think that's enough for today." The doctor blinked, confused. "Mrs. Morales, thank you for your time," she said quickly, her voice shaking. "Matteo's tired." Charles's gaze locked onto hers. "Eleanor, what is this?" "Not here," she whispered. They left the ET office in silence. Outside, the sun was too bright. The world looked wrong, too vivid for what he'd just heard. In the car, Charles gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He spoke without looking at her. What did he mean? That marker, that name? Elena didn't answer. "Elena," he said, his voice low and sharp. "Tell me the truth." She looked down at Matteo, asleep in her arms, innocent and unaware. Her voice broke when she spoke. "I can't." "You can't? Or you won't?" Her eyes filled with tears. "If I tell you, everything changes." He turned to her, his face pale, his heart thundering. "Everything already has." That night he couldn't stop seeing the doctor's face, couldn't stop hearing those words. Ethan Wilson, the name that shouldn't have been in Matteo's file, the marker that shouldn't exist twice. He poured another drink but didn't touch it. The piano in the next room sat in silence, and through the window, the moonlight fell across the same marble floor, where he'd once walked carrying Ethan in his arms. Now, another child's footsteps echoed there, small, hesitant, alive. And Charles Wilson began to understand that fate wasn't done with him yet. The night swallowed the mansion whole. No sounds, no laughter, no life. Only the slow ticking of a clock that seemed to judge every breath Charles took. He paced the study like a man lost between two worlds. On the desk, the old photograph of Ethan, bright eyes, golden hair, a smile too pure for this. Earth stared back at him, and beside it the hospital report the doctor had emailed hours earlier, confirming the genetic anomaly. The same marker, the same sequence. Impossible. He slammed his hand on the table, trembling. "Why would she lie?" he whispered to the empty room. Then he realized he didn't want the answer, because deep down, part of him already knew. He found her in the guest room, sitting by the window, still dressed, hands clasped so tightly they'd gone white. The moonlight turned her face pale, her eyes dark and hollow. "Elena!" She didn't look up. "Elena!" he said again, his voice lower, breaking. "I want the truth. Now." She turned slowly. Tears had already dried on her cheeks. "You don't." "Yes, I do." Her lips trembled. "Please, not in front of him." He glanced toward Matteo, asleep in bed, his small hand resting on the stuffed bear Charles had bought him. He nodded once. Downstairs. The living room felt colder than usual. Charles poured 2 glasses of whiskey, but she didn't touch hers. "Elena," he began, "how does my son's name appear in your child's medical records?" She flinched. "Because they share something more than fate." He stared at her, eyes narrowing. "Don't speak in riddles." Her breath came uneven. "I didn't mean for this to ever come out. I never wanted your pity or your anger. I just wanted my son to live." He leaned forward. "Say it." She looked at him, really looked at him, as if searching for the man he'd been years ago, not the one money and grief had turned him into. Then quietly, she said the words that broke him open. "Matteo is your son." The world stopped. It was a silence so thick that even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Charles blinked, his mind blank. "That's not true?" she whispered. "It is." He shook his head, backing away as if distance could make it untrue. "No, Ethan died. I buried him." She rose from her chair, trembling. "Ethan died, yes, but before he was buried, something happened. At the hospital. Something you weren't told." "What are you saying?" Elena's voice cracked. "You remember the night the storm cut the power at St. Mary's?" He froze. He remembered every second of it. The machines beeping wildly, the nurses rushing, the way the lights flickered as the doctor pronounced Ethan gone. She continued, her words spilling like confession and curse. "I was working there that night, cleaning the pediatric wing. There was chaos everywhere. 2 infants in the same room, your son, and another born to a woman who didn't survive delivery. That baby was mine." Charles stared at her, disbelief and horror mixing in his eyes. When the power went out, the incubators were moved. They looked almost identical. No tags, no monitors. And when the lights came back, one baby was gone. His voice was barely a whisper. "Gone? I don't know who made the mistake," she said, crying now. "A nurse, a doctor, someone desperate to fix the confusion. But when I woke up after fainting, from blood loss, they told me my baby had died, and yours had lived." Charles sank to his knees. "My God, I didn't know," she continued through sobs. "Not until months later, when I saw the discharge papers by accident. The blood type didn't match mine or yours. I tried to tell them, but they said I was confused, that grief makes people imagine things." He looked up at her, eyes blazing. "And you never came to me?" "I was nothing, Charles, a janitor. Who would believe me over you?" He covered his face with both hands, his voice breaking apart. "So you took him?" She hesitated, her lips trembling. "I saved him. When they told me your son had died, they were wrong. Matteo was yours, but he was dying. I couldn't leave him there. He needed someone." "Someone!" he shouted, rising to his feet. "You took my child, Elena." She flinched, but didn't look away. "I raised him when no one else would. I loved him when you were too broken to see he was still here." Her words sliced him open. He turned away, gripping the fireplace mantel, his reflection shaking in the gold-framed mirror. "Do you know what I buried?" he whispered. "A coffin that didn't belong to my son." She closed her eyes, sobbing. "I never wanted to hurt you. I thought it was mercy to let you grieve, to let him live a life where love mattered more than names." Charles turned back toward her, tears streaking his face. "You stole my life from me, and you gave me mine," she said softly. "Without your money, your power, your name, I still gave him something you never could, love without condition." They stood there in silence, 2 worlds colliding, guilt and grace, loss and rebirth, all bound by the child sleeping upstairs. When Charles finally spoke again, his voice was quieter than a whisper. "I want to see him." Elena nodded, her eyes hollow. "He's always wanted you to." The house was silent again, but this time the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, alive with the weight of everything that had been said. Charles climbed the stairs slowly, each step a confession, each breath a prayer he didn't know how to say. At the top of the landing, the faintest light spilled out from the guest room, golden, trembling, fragile. He paused at the doorway. Eleanor sat by the bed, eyes red, her face pale from hours of crying. She looked up when she saw him. No anger, no defense, just the quiet surrender of someone who has told the truth and accepted the cost. Charles stepped inside. His eyes fell on the boy, his boy, sleeping peacefully, small fingers curled around the stuffed bear. The same curls, the same tiny dimple beneath the lip, and when he breathed, that same soft rhythm Ethan once had. He froze. It was like looking at time reversed. He walked closer, careful not to wake him, and sat down beside the bed. For a long while, he just watched. The rise and fall of Matteo's chest, the way the light touched his hair, all the little things he'd buried with his grief. His throat tightened. He whispered, "I missed your whole life, son." Elena turned away, her hand over her mouth to muffle a sob. "I buried you," he continued, his voice cracking, "and now I find out you were here all along, breathing, growing, laughing. I wasn't there for your first word, your first step, your first everything." He covered his face. The weight of years crashed over him. The night spent staring at walls, the bottles emptied to silence a ghost that had never been gone. Elena moved closer, her voice trembling. "I swear I didn't know in the beginning. When I realized it was too late, I thought if I told you they'd take him away, and I'd lose him too." He looked up at her, eyes full of tears. "You should have trusted me." "I didn't trust anyone," she whispered. "Not after that night." Charles looked back at the sleeping boy. "He looks like his mother." Elena nodded. "He has your eyes, though." That broke him completely. He leaned forward and gently took the child's hand. Small, warm, "You're fragile." And for the first time in years, the tears that fell from his eyes weren't born of pain, but of love rediscovered. He kissed the boy's fingers and whispered, "I'm here now." Outside, the wind stirred through the garden, brushing the yellow roses Matteo had admired days before. The moonlight poured through the window, falling over the three of them, mother, father, son, bound by mistake, mercy, and miracle. Eleanor sat beside him, her voice barely audible. "What will you do now?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at her, really seeing her, not as the woman who had taken his child, but as the one who had kept him alive when the world failed them both. "I don't know," he said softly, "but whatever happens next, he's not going to grow up wondering who he is." Her lips trembled. "You're not angry." "I am," he said, and his voice broke again. "But not at you, at fate, at the world, at myself, for giving up before the story was finished." Elena reached out hesitantly, as if afraid to touch him. Her fingers brushed his hand, and for the first time he didn't pull away. Hours passed in quiet peace. Charles sat there until dawn, watching the light change from silver to gold. When Matteo finally stirred, blinking sleepily, his first word was soft and innocent. "Dad." Charles froze. He hadn't expected it. Not so soon, not so simply. He swallowed hard, his voice barely more than breath. "Yes, son." The boy smiled, still half asleep, and reached for him. Charles lifted him carefully into his arms, feeling the small heartbeat against his chest, steady and real. He closed his eyes, whispering into the boy's hair, "You're home now." And for the first time in 3 years, the world stopped hurting. The morning light spilled softly through the curtains, painting the mansion in a pale gold glow. But for Charles, it didn't feel like morning. It felt like the moment after a storm, when the clouds had gone, but the air still trembled with thunder that hadn't finished speaking. He stood in the hallway outside the guest room, listening to the sound of small laughter echoing down the stairs. Matteo was awake, building towers of wooden blocks on the carpet. Elena's voice followed, warm but tired, guiding him gently. Charles closed his eyes. He wanted to step in, to join them. But how could he, when every breath reminded him that he'd been robbed of the first 3 years of his son's life? When he finally entered, Matteo looked up, beaming. "Good morning, Dad." Charles froze, his heart stumbling over the word. He hadn't told the boy the truth, not yet, but somehow the child already knew what his heart refused to deny. "Morning, son," he whispered. Later that day, he stood in his study again, this time not to hide but to think. On the desk lay 2 folders, one labeled legal, the other press. His lawyer had called early, warning that the truth would eventually leak. A story like this: a hospital mistake, a child switched at birth, a millionaire's son raised by a maid. It was the kind of tragedy that tabloids worshipped. He could already see the headlines. The billionaire's lost son. The maid who stole a heir. He closed the folders. The noise of the world didn't matter anymore. He walked out to the garden, where Elena was hanging laundry in the sun. Matteo sat nearby, watching butterflies flutter between the yellow roses Charles had planted just days ago. For a moment, it looked like peace, fragile, temporary, but real. "Elena," he said softly. She turned, shielding her eyes from the light. "Yes? I've been thinking. The world will find out. It always does, but I don't want him to live a life shaped by someone else's story." Her expression shifted, fear mixed with love. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath. "We won't tell anyone, not now, not yet, not until he's old enough to choose what truth he wants to carry." Tears filled her eyes. "You'd protect me? After everything?" He shook his head. "Not you. Us." Elena lowered her hands, trembling. "But what about his name? His inheritance?" "I'll change the papers quietly," he said. "If the law can't make it right, then I will. He'll have both our names. No one will take that from him again." That night, when Matteo was asleep, Charles sat in the piano room, the same melody rising beneath his fingers, the lullaby that had traveled across lifetimes to reach its home. Elena stood at the doorway, watching him play. "You remember it too?" he asked without turning. "I used to hum it to him when he couldn't sleep," she said softly. "Maybe he remembered it from before he was even born." He smiled faintly. "Maybe love doesn't die. Maybe it just changes address." She walked closer. "You forgive me then?" He stopped playing. Silence filled the room again. "I don't know if forgiveness is something you decide," he said finally. "Maybe it's something that just happens when the pain runs out of strength." Her eyes filled. "I'm sorry, Charles. I know." He looked at her then, really looked, not as the woman who had taken his son, but as the one who had carried the pieces of his soul when he couldn't. He reached out, and for the first time, his hand brushed hers without hesitation. "Let's raise him together," he said quietly. "Not as penance, but as parents." Eleanor nodded, tears slipping silently down her face. The clock struck midnight. In the next room, a child dreamed, no longer an orphan of fate, but the bridge between two broken worlds, learning how to heal. And downstairs, a man who had once sworn he'd never love again whispered to the dark, "Thank you for giving me back what I lost," even if it came dressed as forgiveness. Days turned into weeks, and the world outside the mansion kept moving. Indifferent, impatient, unaware that inside those golden walls, 3 lives had quietly rewoven the fabric of destiny. Charles and Elena lived carefully now, like 2 souls learning to breathe in the same rhythm without breaking the fragile peace between them. Every word mattered, every silence too. The staff noticed changes, the way their employer smiled more often, the sound of laughter echoing down the halls where grief had once slept. But no one dared ask questions. The mansion had rules: don't look too closely, don't speak too loudly, and never wonder why the past seemed to have changed its shape. In the mornings, Charles took Matteo to the garden, where the boy learned to stand with his braces against the wooden rail. "Look at you," Charles said, pride swelling in his chest. "You're almost there." Matteo grinned, sweat glistening on his forehead. "Almost doesn't count, Dad," Charles laughed. "Who told you that?" "Mom." He chuckled softly. "Then your mom's wise." Elena watched them from the kitchen window, her hands trembling slightly as she dried the same cup twice. There was beauty in the sight, but danger too. If anyone learned the truth, everything could disappear overnight. Still, she couldn't look away. One afternoon, while Matteo napped, Charles found Elena in the library sorting through books. He noticed how the sunlight caught her hair, how her hands moved with quiet care, how the air between them no longer carried fear, just a soft kind of knowing. "You don't have to work, you know," he said. She smiled faintly. "I do. It keeps me from remembering too much." He leaned against the bookshelf. "And if I don't want you to forget?" She froze for a moment, then turned. "You want to remember pain?" "No," he said softly. "I want to remember why it stopped." Their eyes met, and for a moment the air thickened, heavy with everything unspoken. He took a small step forward. "Eleanor." Before he could say more, the sound of the doorbell cut through the quiet. They both flinched, startled by something as ordinary as a visitor. Charles frowned. No one's supposed to come today? He walked to the foyer, Eleanor following close behind. The butler opened the door. A man stood there, tall, thin, holding a folder and a camera bag. "Good afternoon," he said smoothly. "I'm from the New York Herald. Mr. Wilson, may I have a word?" Charles's chest tightened. "About what?" The reporter smiled faintly. "A story. Rumors, actually. About a child. A boy." Elena's breath caught. Charles stepped forward, voice steady but dangerous. "You should leave. Now." But the reporter didn't move. "Mr. Wilson, people talk. Nurses remember. There are records. 2 babies born the same night, one declared dead. Would you like to comment before we publish?" The room went cold. Elena reached for Matteo's photograph on the table, instinctively hiding it behind her back. Charles's hand clenched at his side. "You have no idea what you're stirring," he said quietly. "Oh, I think I do," the reporter replied. "It's quite the story. A billionaire's child switched at birth, raised by his maid. The world will eat it alive." Charles took a step closer, his voice low. "Get out." The reporter hesitated, then smirked, tucking the folder under his arm. "I'll take that as a no comment. Have a nice day, Mr. Wilson." He turned and walked down the steps, the sound of gravel crunching beneath his shoes, echoing like a countdown. Elena turned to him, her face white as paper. "What do we do?" Charles looked out the window, watching the car disappear through the gates. "We do what parents do," he said grimly. "We protect our child." Her voice trembled. "They'll come back. Then we'll be ready." That night, the mansion felt alive again, not with warmth, but with warning. Charles made calls to lawyers, old friends, contacts he hadn't spoken to in years. He told them nothing, only that silence had to be bought, and quickly. Elena stayed by Matteo's side, pretending everything was normal. She hummed softly while brushing his hair, but her eyes kept flicking toward the window, afraid of headlights that might stop outside. When the boy finally fell asleep, she walked down to the study. Charles was there, his face pale in the lamplight, staring at the piano keys without touching them. "They know," she said quietly. "Yes." Her hands shook. "If this comes out, they'll take him from us." He met her eyes, voice calm and absolute. "No, they won't." "What if they prove what I did?" He stood and walked toward her, stopping close enough that she could hear the tremor in his breathing. "Then I'll say I ordered it, that it was my fault, that you were following my instructions." Her eyes widened. "You destroy yourself for us?" He smiled sadly. "I already did once. It's time to do it for the right reason." Outside, thunder rolled again, distant this time, like a memory refusing to fade. They stood there in silence, 2 people holding a secret bigger than both their lives. Upstairs, a boy dreamed peacefully, unaware that love sometimes meant lying to the world just to let truth survive a little longer. And as lightning flashed across the sky, Charles whispered to her, "No one will ever take him from us. Not again." It began with a headline. No warning, no courtesy call, just truth stripped and rewritten for profit. The next morning, Charles opened the newspaper, and there it was, printed across the front page in bold, cruel letters. "Billionaire's son switched at birth. Maid raises heir in secret." The article was merciless. Photos of the mansion, quotes from hospital staff, even a grainy picture of Eleanor pushing Matteo's wheelchair outside the clinic. They had twisted the story into scandal. Love turned into deceit. Sacrifice turned into theft. Charles's jaw tightened. He turned the page and saw his own photo beneath the headline, "Charles Wilson, the father who didn't know." Elena's scream echoed from the hallway. She held her phone, trembling. "They know my name," she whispered. "My face. They know where we live." Charles took the phone gently from her hand and turned it off. "They won't touch you," he said. "I'll make sure of it." Tears streamed down her cheeks. "They're calling me a kidnapper." He stepped closer, his voice steady but low. "You saved him. Never forget that. You saved our son." By evening, the reporters had gathered outside the gates, cameras flashing, drones buzzing above the garden, voices shouting questions into the wind. "Mr. Wilson, is it true your maid stole your baby? Elena Morales, will you face charges? Who is the boy's real family?" Charles watched from the window, his reflection fractured by raindrops. The world was hungry for blood. He turned to Elena. "Pack a bag for him," she blinked. "What? We're leaving." "Where?" "Anywhere they can't reach us." That night, under heavy rain, they slipped out through the servants' gate. A billionaire, a maid, and a child wrapped in a yellow blanket. The mansion loomed behind them, lights flashing from the chaos of photographers and police cars. Charles's driver met them at the edge of the property. He didn't ask questions. He simply opened the door and whispered, "Safe house is ready, sir." The ride was silent. Matteo slept across Charles's lap, his small hand gripping his father's shirt, even in dreams. Elena stared out the window, her face pale under the passing streetlights. When she finally spoke, her voice was a ghost. "I never wanted this. I know. I thought love could stay quiet forever. It never does," Charles said softly. "The world always punishes what it doesn't understand." The safe house sat on the edge of the countryside, quiet, hidden by trees and fog, a small cabin, warm inside, smelling of cedar and dust. Eleanor lit a candle. Charles closed the curtains. For the first time in days, there was silence. But it wasn't peace. It was the kind that comes after running too far to stop. Eleanor broke it first. "How long can we stay here?" "As long as it takes." "And after?" He looked down at Matteo, asleep by the fire. "After, we start over." Her voice trembled. "With new names?" He nodded slowly. "New names, new lives, but the same. Love." Outside, the rain eased. Inside, the candlelight flickered against their faces. Two people who had lost everything but found the one thing the world couldn't counterfeit. Charles watched the flame dance and whispered to himself, "They can take my fortune, my name, my legacy, but they'll never take my son." Elena met his eyes. "And what about me?" He smiled faintly, his voice quiet but certain. "You're part of that too." That night, as the fire burned low, Charles looked down at the boy, sleeping between them. The storm outside had passed, but inside, in their hearts, it still rumbled soft but alive. The world could scream, the world could curse. But for now, love had won another night. The first days in hiding were strangely quiet. No reporters, no cameras, no whispers, just the sound of wind brushing through the pine trees that circled the cabin like sentinels. Charles woke early every morning, lighting the fireplace before the sun rose. Elena cooked simple meals, bread, soup, coffee. Matteo laughed as if the world had never tried to take his peace, but the silence carried a question neither of them dared to voice. How long can peace survive when truth is still alive? A week later, Charles's lawyer found them. He arrived discreetly, his car coated in dust, his face lined with exhaustion. He handed Charles a folder and whispered, "It's getting worse." Inside were headlines from around the world. Maid claims billionaire's son. DNA confirms swapped babies in Isha's high-profile case. Elena Morales, angel or thief? Charles closed the folder slowly. "They got the tests." The lawyer nodded. "Someone leaked the medical records. The hospital's under investigation. The board wants a statement. If you stay silent, they'll control the narrative." Eleanor stood frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "What does that mean?" "It means," the lawyer said carefully, "you could face charges, kidnapping, fraud, obstruction, even if it wasn't your fault." Charles looked at her. Her face was pale but calm, her eyes full of quiet resignation. She whispered, "Maybe it's time to stop running." "No," Charles said immediately. "Charles, listen." "No." His voice broke, rough and trembling. "You carried my son. You saved him. You gave him life. If anyone stands trial, it'll be me." That night, after Matteo fell asleep, Charles stood outside the cabin looking up at the stars. The same stars that had watched over him when he'd buried a child that wasn't his. He whispered to the cold air, "If truth wants blood, it can have mine." When he walked back inside, Elena was waiting by the fire. He sat across from her, exhaustion etched into his face. "I'm going to the press," he said quietly. She shook her head. "You'll lose everything." "I already did. The only thing left to lose is my silence." Tears welled in her eyes. "If you do this, they'll destroy you." He smiled sadly. "Then let them try. Maybe it's time the world learned the difference between a crime and a miracle." The next morning, Charles Wilson held a press conference in the rain. He stood alone behind a wooden podium in front of flashing cameras and restless reporters. They shouted questions before he could even speak. "Did the maid steal your son? Is she hiding with you now? Is the boy yours?" He raised a hand. The noise fell away. "My name is Charles Wilson," he began, his voice steady. "And yes, Mateo is my son." The reporters gasped. He continued, "3 years ago, I lost a child. I buried him. I drowned in grief. But what I didn't know was that my son was alive, because a woman named Elena Morales refused to let him die." He paused, letting the rain fill the silence. "She didn't steal him. She saved him. When the hospital made its mistake, she gave him what I couldn't: love, a home, hope. She kept him alive long enough for me to find him again." Someone shouted, "Will she face charges?" Charles looked straight into the cameras. "If anyone dares to accuse her, they'll have to accuse me first, because if loving your child, no matter how you found him, is a crime, then I'm guilty too." The world listened. For days, news anchors replayed his speech, dissected every line, every tear. But for once, the story changed. The headlines shifted from "the maid who stole a son" to "the woman who saved one." Public sympathy flooded in. Donations for children's hospitals, letters of support, and silence from the people who once shouted the loudest. Weeks later, the family returned to the mansion, not as fugitives but as survivors. The gates stayed closed, the cameras gone. Life moved quietly, beautifully, simply. Elena tended the garden. Charles worked less, lived more. And Mateo, finally walking with lighter braces, ran through the halls laughing, the sound echoing through the house that had once been a tomb. One evening, as the sun bled orange and gold across the horizon, Charles sat by the piano. Mateo climbed into his lap, small fingers, pressing random keys. "That's your song," Charles said softly, "the one that found its way back to us." Elena stood at the doorway, smiling faintly. "It always does." He looked at her, his voice barely a whisper. "After everything, do you think we deserve peace?" She walked closer, brushing a hand against his shoulder. "We didn't steal peace, Charles. We earned it." As the night deepened, the house glowed from within, warm, alive, and full again. For the first time in years, there were no secrets left to hide. Only love, scarred and real, standing quietly where tragedy once lived. And as the piano played the lullaby one last time, Charles whispered, "Sometimes the truth doesn't break us. It brings us home." Peace, as it turned out, wasn't free. It came with paperwork, hearings, signatures, and people in suits who spoke in cold, measured words about lives they'd never touched. Months after the press conference, after the headlines softened and the cameras moved on, the letters began to arrive, first from the hospital, then from the state, then from a district attorney who had never lost a high-profile case and didn't want this to be the first. They called it an investigation into medical negligence and potential abduction. They wrapped tragedy in legal language and asked the same question in 1,000 different ways. Who does this child really belong to? Charles sat at the long wooden table in his lawyer's office, hands folded, jaw tight. Elena sat beside him, fingers tangled in each other, her knuckles white. Across from them, a stack of documents looked taller than Mateo. "It will go to a hearing," the lawyer said. "Probably a public one. They need to show the world they did something." "Did something?" Charles repeated quietly. "They're the ones who made the mistake." The lawyer nodded. "And now they're looking for someone to blame. Hospitals don't like admitting they're human." Elena swallowed hard. "Will they try to take him?" The room went still. The lawyer's eyes softened. They may argue that what happened was irregular, that custody should have been established formally, not emotionally. Emotionally, Charles echoed, anger flaring in his chest. Is that what we call saving a child now? Elena's voice trembled. If they ask Matteo what he wants, he'll say he wants us. Doesn't that matter? The lawyer sighed. It should, but the law doesn't always speak the language of the heart. Charles leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. Then I'll teach it. The courthouse smelled like polished wood and old arguments. On the day of the hearing, the steps outside were lined with cameras again. No chaos this time, just quiet expectation. Inside, the courtroom was crowded. Reporters, hospital representatives, lawyers in dark suits, a judge with tired eyes. And in the middle of it all, a small boy in a tiny blazer sitting between a man and a woman who were trying not to show how terrified they were. Matteo swung his feet above the floor, braces peeking out beneath neatly pressed pants. He looked around curiously, then leaned toward Eleanor. Is this like school? He whispered. She forced a smile, a little louder, a lot less fun. Charles squeezed his son's hand gently. We're here together. That's what matters. The state's attorney stood first, voice smooth and practiced. He spoke of procedures, chain of custody, medical records, liability. To him, Matteo was the child, not a boy with a favorite toy car. And a laugh that made the world feel less cruel, just a name in a file, a problem to be resolved. Then it was their turn. Elena Morales, the judge said, please stand. Her knees almost buckled, but she rose. Charles wanted to stand beside her, but the lawyer motioned for him to wait. Mrs. Morales, the prosecutor began, do you admit that you left the hospital with a child who was not legally recognized as yours? Her lips trembled. I left with a baby who had no one. A baby, they told me, was mine, then later said was dead. You were aware there was a mix-up with records. I was aware that if I left him there, he would die alone. Murmurs rippled through the room. The prosecutor adjusted his glasses. So, in your own words, you made the decision to take him without informing the father. She swallowed. The father was broken, and I was nobody. No one was listening. He smirked slightly. And yet now you sit beside one of the most powerful men in the country. Before she could answer, Charles stood. Enough. The judge raised a hand. Mr. Wilson, you want the story? Charles said, eyes blazing. Here it is. A hospital failed. A system failed. I failed. I walked away from my son's grave and never questioned what they put in the ground. She didn't walk away. She picked up what the world dropped. The courtroom fell silent. He turned to the judge, his voice raw. If you're looking for someone to blame, blame me, but don't you dare call what she did a crime. The judge watched him, eyes unreadable. Mr. Wilson, the prosecutor said carefully, this isn't about feelings, it's about facts. Facts? Charles shot back. Here's a fact. That boy calls her mom and me dad. Another fact. Without her, he wouldn't be alive. Without her, I'd still be drinking myself to death in an empty mansion. Tell me, counselor, is there a section in your code for that? A few people in the room lowered their eyes. Some wiped away tears before they fell. At last, it was Matteo's turn. The judge leaned forward, voice surprisingly gentle. Matteo, do you know why you're here today? The boy shrugged. Because grown-ups don't know how to share? Soft laughter rippled through the courtroom. The judge smiled. Something like that? Can I ask you a question? Yes, sir. Who do you want to live with? Matteo didn't hesitate. With them, he said, pointing first to Elena, then to Charles. They're my home. Do you know who they are? Yes, the boy said proudly. She's my mom. He's my dad. God took a long way to put us together, but he did it anyway. The judge stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. Thank you, Matteo. You've said more in one sentence than this room has in hours. The hearing lasted the whole day. Arguments, objections, evidence, testimonies. At sunset, the judge finally spoke. This is not a simple case, he began. Law rarely is, but sometimes the law has to listen to something older than itself. He paused, looking at the three of them. A Mistake was committed by an institution that should have known better. A woman with no power made a choice out of love, not malice. A man who lost a son found him again because she refused to let that child die. I cannot, in good conscience, call that kidnapping. I can only call it fate, badly documented. A nervous chuckle slipped through the room. The court recognizes both biological and emotional parenthood in this case. Mateo will remain under the joint custody of Charles Wilson and Elena Morales as legal and rightful guardians. No further action will be taken against them. He looked directly at the prosecutor. If someone must be investigated, let it be the system that failed them. The gavel struck. Case closed. Outside, the sky burned in shades of gold and purple. Cameras waited at the bottom of the steps, but for a moment, none of that mattered. At the top of the stairs, Mateo reached for both their hands, one small palm in each of theirs. Elena looked at Charles, tears glistening. "We won." He shook his head softly. "No, we survived." Mateo grinned. "Does that mean we can go home now?" Charles smiled, the kind of smile that only comes after losing everything and finding more than you had before. "Yes, son," he whispered. "Now, we really can." Months passed, and the house that once held silence began to hum again. Not with noise, with life. The curtains stayed open now. The staff returned, smiling instead of whispering. The smell of breakfast reached every room, and laughter, soft, contagious laughter, floated up the grand staircase every morning. For the first time in years, Charles didn't dread waking up. He didn't see ghosts in the hallways anymore. He saw footprints, small, uneven, human footprints that made the marble floor feel holy again. Mateo had grown stronger. The braces stayed, but now they were only a reminder of how far he'd come. Every day, he'd climb a few more steps of the staircase, one at a time, while Charles stood behind him. Hands ready, heart pounding. "Almost there, champ," he'd say. And Mateo, breathing hard but smiling wide, would whisper back, "Almost doesn't count, Dad." Eleanor always watched from the bottom of the stairs, tears of pride hidden behind her laughter. She'd clap quietly, and the boy would beam, the kind of joy that turned survival into art. Life, however, didn't simply return to normal. It transformed. Charles began to spend less time in boardrooms and more in hospitals. He visited pediatric wards across the city, quietly funding equipment, renovations and programs under one new name, the Ethan and Mateo Foundation. When the press asked why, he said simply, "To make sure no child is ever lost in the dark again." One evening, while the sun bled gold through the windows, Charles found Elena in the garden, trimming yellow roses, the same ones that had watched their story unfold. He stood for a while, watching her. The air smelled of earth and rain. The light caught her hair, like it was spun from something softer than forgiveness. "You've turned this place into something living again," he said finally. She smiled faintly. "It wasn't the place that needed life. It was us." He stepped closer, hands in his pockets. "Do you ever regret it? Taking him that night?" Her smile faded. She looked at the roses, her fingers brushing the petals. "Every night I asked myself that. Every morning I knew I couldn't have done anything else." He nodded slowly. "Then we're the same." She turned to him. "The same?" Two people who broke the rules for love, and somehow made it right. Their eyes met, quiet, honest, unguarded, and for the first time, neither of them looked away. Later that night, the three of them sat by the piano. Mateo had insisted on learning the lullaby. His small hands hit the wrong keys, and every mistake made him laugh louder. Charles guided his fingers. "No, son, this one's the heart note." "The what?" "The one that makes people cry even when they don't know why." Elena leaned against the piano, smiling softly. "You're both terrible musicians," Charles grinned. "Maybe, but we've got good rhythm." And when the boy finally played the right chord, bright and pure, the house seemed to exhale. Walls that had once mourned now glowed. Rooms that had been tombs now listened. As the night deepened, Charles looked at them, the woman who'd saved his son, and the child who'd saved his soul. He whispered, almost to himself, "I used to think I was cursed." But maybe I was just being rewritten. Elena looked up. Rewritten, he nodded. Some stories aren't meant to end where they begin. They're meant to find their way home. She smiled through her tears. Then this is home. He reached out, resting his hand over hers. Finally. And the house, the one that had once belonged to grief, learned to breathe again. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that pretends life has finally settled. The sky was calm, the garden alive with the sound of bees, and Charles was in the study helping Matteo build a miniature airplane. Like this? The boy asked, squinting at the instructions. Charles smiled. Almost. The wings go on top, not underneath. Like angels, Matteo said, his grin wide and pure. Charles froze at the word angels. He still thought of Ethan sometimes, not with pain anymore, but with gratitude. It was as if one son had carried another back to him through time. Before he could answer, a knock came at the door. Firm. Measured. The kind that doesn't belong to a guest, but to someone who carries unfinished business. Elena opened it. A man stood on the threshold, tall, grey-haired, his suit pressed with precision. He held a leather folder under one arm. Mr. Wilson, he said formally, my name is Dr. Peter Lang. I was the medical director at St. Mary's Hospital, the night your son was born. Elena's face drained of colour. Charles set down the toy airplane slowly. The past had found them. They sat in the living room, the same place where truths had once shattered everything. Dr. Lang placed the folder on the coffee table and folded his hands. I won't take much of your time, he said quietly, but I need to say this, face to face. It's been 3 years since the investigation, and I've carried something I can't die with. Charles leaned forward, eyes sharp. Go on. Lang looked at Elena. You were the janitor that night. I remember your face. You fainted after the power cut. I was the one who signed. Both certificates, one birth, one death. Elena swallowed hard. You told me my baby was gone. He nodded, guilt flickering across his features. Because I believed it. The chaos was unimaginable. 2 incubators, identical babies, no labels. The staff was panicking. We thought we were saving time by moving the infants manually. He exhaled shakily. But I later realized we switched them. It wasn't until the DNA test surfaced that I knew without doubt what we'd done. I came today to apologize. Not as a doctor, but as a man who failed both of you. Charles's jaw clenched. You cost me 3 years with my son. Lang nodded. And you can hate me for it. You'd be right to. But I also came with something else. The file you were never given. He pushed the folder toward Charles. Inside were documents, test results, photos from that night. Among them, one detail caught his eye. A handwritten note at the bottom of the final page. Infant B, stabilized after oxygen failure. Monitored by Nurse E. Klein. Charles frowned. Nurse Klein? Lang hesitated. She was the one who moved the incubators during the blackout. She disappeared a week later. No record, no forwarding address. Eleanor's voice trembled. You think she knew? Lang nodded slowly. I think she couldn't live with it. For a moment, silence filled the room, thick, suffocating. Charles stared at the documents spread across the table. So many lines, so many mistakes dressed as facts. All of it leading to one miracle. The child asleep upstairs. He closed the folder gently. You came here for forgiveness, Dr. Lang, but you already gave it to us. The man blinked, confused. How? By telling the truth, Charles said. You gave our son back a history that finally makes sense. Lang's lips trembled. I don't deserve your grace. Neither did we, Elena said softly. But life gave it anyway. The doctor stood, eyes glistening. Thank you. That's more mercy than I ever gave myself. As he turned to leave, Matteo appeared at the doorway, rubbing his eyes. Dad? Who's that? Charles smiled faintly. Someone who helped fix a mistake, son. Matteo nodded, yawning. Then he's a good man. Lang's breath hitched. You have a beautiful boy, Mr. Wilson. Charles looked down at his son and whispered, I know. After the doctor left, Elena and Charles stood together by the window, watching the car disappear beyond the gates. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, she said, "Do you believe him?" Charles nodded, slowly. "I do, but it doesn't change what we have. It only explains how we got here." She smiled faintly. "Fate, badly documented." He chuckled. "You remember the judge's words." "How could I forget?" she said, turning to him. "They were the first ones that made sense." He looked at her, and for a long, quiet moment they didn't need to speak at all. That night, as the wind brushed through the trees, Charles stood at the window again, holding a glass of water instead of whiskey. Down the hall, he heard Elena humming softly to Matteo, the same lullaby that had traveled across lifetimes to find its way back home. The melody drifted through the air, wrapping around him like forgiveness made sound. He closed his eyes and whispered to the night, "Ethan, wherever you are, thank you for sending him back." Winter came gently that year, not with cold, with stillness, the kind that lets you breathe without fear of what the next morning will take away. The garden was quiet, golden leaves scattered across the path. Inside the mansion, the fireplace crackled, filling the air with the scent of cedar and peace. Charles sat at the piano, lost in thought, fingers hovering over the keys. He didn't play yet. He was waiting for them. Moments later, the door creaked open and soft footsteps echoed on the marble floor. Elena entered, holding a small frame wrapped in paper. Matteo followed, balancing something carefully in his tiny hands, 2 white candles. Charles looked up, smiling. "What's all this?" Elena placed the frame gently on the piano. "A new beginning," she said. Matteo grinned. "It's for Ethan." Charles's breath caught. He looked down at the frame. Inside was a drawing made by Matteo himself. 2 boys holding hands under a sun that looked like a golden coin. One labeled Ethan, the other Matteo. Above them, in crooked letters, it read, "Brothers forever." They lit the candles together, one for the child who had been lost, one for the child who had been found. And as the flames danced, Elena began to hum softly, that same lullaby that had followed them through years of pain and forgiveness. Charles joined her, his deep voice weaving through hers like a promise. The melody rose, slow and haunting, carrying the names of both boys into the night. "Sleep, my sons, in the arms of love." One watched from the stars, one from the earth below. 2 hearts, 1 story, 1 song. Matteo's voice joined theirs, off-key but bright, and the house filled with a sound, not mourning anymore, but celebration. When the last note faded, Elena wiped her eyes and smiled. "He should know he's not gone," she said softly. "He isn't," Charles replied. "He's just changed address." They sat in silence, the 3 of them watching the candles burn side by side. The wax dripped, mingling on the piano's polished surface until it became one shape, white and golden, inseparable. Later that night, Charles walked through the mansion halls, stopping at the old portrait of Ethan, the one he hadn't been able to look at for years. He touched the frame lightly, whispering, "I thought I lost you, son, but you just came back wearing a new smile." Behind him, footsteps approached, small ones. Matteo looked up, sleepy-eyed. "Dad?" "Yes." "Champ, can Ethan hear us?" Charles knelt. "Always." The boy nodded, thoughtful. "Then I'll keep singing, so he doesn't get lonely up there." Charles's throat tightened. "That's a good idea." Matteo took his father's hand. "You can sing too if you miss him." "I will." The next morning, they drove together to St. Mary's Hospital. Charles had requested something quietly, not as a rich man, but as a father. In the small garden behind the building, a new plaque had been placed between 2 white rose bushes. It read, "The Ethan and Matteo Garden, dedicated to the miracle of love that outlived loss." Elena traced the letters with her fingers. "They'll always be together now." Charles nodded, the way it should have been. They stood there for a long time, just breathing, listening to the wind in the trees. Somewhere nearby, a nurse hummed the same lullaby without knowing where she'd heard it before. And for the first time in forever, it didn't sound like goodbye. It sounded like home. That night, as they returned to the mansion, the candles on the piano were still burning faintly, their flames smaller now, but steady. two lights that had survived the storm. Eleanor leaned against the doorframe, her voice quiet. "What? Happens now?" Charles looked at her, then at the boy chasing his shadow across the floor. "Now," he said softly, "we live for both of them." Spring returned like forgiveness made visible. The garden bloomed in gold and white, and every morning sunlight flooded through the windows like a quiet blessing. For the first time since the trial, everything felt settled. No reporters, no whispers, only the sound of laughter and the rhythm of small footsteps echoing through marble floors that had once known only silence. But inside Charles's heart, something still felt unfinished. He had wealth, peace, and the two souls that had rewritten his life, yet he knew names held power. And the name Mateo Morales told only half the story. That morning he called Elena into the study. She entered carefully, drying her hands on her apron. He smiled. She still refused to act like someone who lived in a mansion. "Sit," he said gently. She frowned. "Is something wrong?" He shook his head. "No, something's right. I just want to make it official." She tilted her head. "Official?" Charles opened a small folder on the desk. Inside were papers, crisp, new, embossed with a gold seal. Her eyes widened as she read the heading. Legal petition for name amendment and dual custody recognition. "Elena Morales," he said softly. "I want to give our son a name that carries both of us. Everything we are, everything we've survived." She blinked, her throat tightening. "Charles, you don't have to—" I do," he interrupted gently. "Mateo didn't just come from my blood. He came from your courage. Without you, there would be no future to name." She stared at him, trembling. "What name did you choose?" He turned the document toward her. In the blank space, written in clean black ink, were the words, Mateo Ethan Wilson Morales. Elena pressed her hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely. "You gave him Ethan's name." Charles nodded, his voice breaking. "He deserves both, the past and the future. One son who waited in heaven, one who stayed on earth, and one name to keep them together." She couldn't speak, so she only reached across the desk and covered his hand with hers. The hearing for the name change was quiet, held in a small room at City Hall. No cameras this time, no press, just the three of them, a judge with kind eyes, and a piece of paper that carried more love than any title ever could. When the judge asked, "What name shall this child bear from this day forward?" Charles and Elena spoke together, their voices steady. "Mateo Ethan Wilson Morales." The judge smiled. "A beautiful name for a beautiful story." Mateo giggled, swinging his feet. "Does that mean I'm famous?" Charles laughed softly. "No, son. It means you're home." Later that day they returned to the mansion, where the sun painted the floor in golden streaks. Charles lifted Mateo onto his shoulders. "So, Mr. Wilson Morales," he said with mock seriousness, "what's the first thing you'll do with your new name?" Mateo thought for a second, grinning. "Eat cake," Elena laughed, wiping her eyes. "Good choice." And so, that evening, they baked one together. Lopsided, messy, covered in frosting fingerprints and laughter. Charles wrote the name across it in chocolate icing, his handwriting shaky. "Welcome home, Mateo Ethan." When night came, they stood together in the garden. The stars above seemed to burn a little brighter, maybe because one of them, far away, was smiling. Eleanor whispered, "Do you think Ethan would be proud?" Charles looked up at the sky. "He already is. He sent us the best part of himself." They stood in silence, their son between them, holding both their hands. 3 names, 1 story. 3 hearts, 1 family. And as the wind carried the scent of roses and candle wax, Charles whispered to the night, "Some names are written on paper, others are written on the soul." The years that followed were quiet, but not small. They didn't chase headlines anymore. They built something better, something that whispered instead of shouted. What began as one family's tragedy slowly became the heartbeat of a movement. Hospitals across the country started to adopt a new protocol, one pioneered by the foundation Charles and Elena created, the Ethan and Matteo Initiative. It wasn't about technology or efficiency. It was about human eyes, human care, and human love. At every hospital that joined, a small plaque hung on the wall. No child will be lost in the dark again. Charles no longer lived in the boardroom. His meetings were with doctors, social workers, and nurses instead of investors. He gave interviews rarely, and when he did, he never spoke of wealth, only of mercy. "I used to measure success in numbers," he told one reporter. "Now I measure it in heartbeats that never stop too soon." Elena, meanwhile, became the quiet architect of change. She trained volunteers, wrote letters to mothers who had lost children, comforted strangers who thought they couldn't go on. When people called her a hero, she only shook her head. "I'm just a mother who refused to forget what love sounds like." Matteo grew. His legs grew stronger, his braces lighter, his laughter louder. By age 7, he walked across the foundation's first children's therapy center without help. Every step a small miracle. The crowd clapped. Charles tried not to cry, but failed. Elena stood beside him, her hands clasped, whispering prayers of thanks. When Matteo reached the podium, he looked out at the sea of faces and said simply, "My mom says love fixes things money can't. My dad says love costs everything, but it's worth it. I think they're both right." The audience rose to their feet. Cameras flashed, not for a story of scandal, but for a story of redemption. That night, after the event, the three of them walked along the riverbank near the hospital where it all began. The city lights reflected on the water, scattered like stars that had fallen and decided to stay. "Dad," Matteo said, his small hand in Charles's, "will people remember Ethan too?" Charles smiled, looking down at him. "Every time someone is saved because of what we built, they'll be saying his name without even knowing it." Elena added softly, "Light never asks to be remembered, it just keeps shining." They stopped on a bridge, where lanterns floated across the river, a memorial tradition started by families who'd lost children and found hope again through the foundation. Charles handed Matteo a lantern of their own. "Go on, son. Make a wish." Matteo thought for a long time, then whispered, "I wish no one ever cries alone again." Together, they placed the lantern on the water. It drifted slowly, joining hundreds of others, glowing softly against the dark. For a moment, it looked like the entire river had caught fire, a ribbon of light winding through the heart of the city. Elena leaned against Charles's shoulder, whispering, "Do you see it?" He nodded. "It's them. Every child, every name, every life we thought was gone." Back home, the plaque at the mansion entrance had been changed. It no longer read, "The Wilson Estate." It now said, "House of Ethan and Matteo," where every lost story finds its way back to the light. And under it, a single line written by Charles himself. "We were broken people once. Then love put us back together, piece by piece." As the years passed, the world began to forget the scandal, but it remembered the light. Hospitals, orphanages, and shelters bore the name of the foundation in cities far away. Children who had no one began to call each other brother and sister under its roof. The world called it charity. Charles called it forgiveness with a roof. One night, while closing the piano after another lullaby, he looked at Elena and said quietly, "We thought we were saving one boy. Turns out he saved the world around him." She smiled, brushing a hand through his hair. The world just needed to remember how to love. He looked toward the stairs, where Matteo's laughter still echoed faintly, and for the first time he realized they hadn't just built a home, they'd built a legacy of light. 20 years later, the city had changed, but the wind outside St. Mary's Hospital still carried the same gentle hum. The same golden light spilled through the windows at dusk, and the same garden bloomed behind the building, where 2 rose bushes still stood side by side. And walking through those gates, tall now, with calm brown eyes and a soft confidence that made people turn and smile, was Dr. Matteo Ethan Wilson Morales. He wore no tie, no arrogance, just the quiet grace of someone who had grown from love, not status. The little boy who once stumbled now walked with steady steps, though he still carried the faintest trace of the limp that made his gait unique, almost musical. He stopped at the bronze plaque that bore his own name, the Ethan and Matteo Garden. He touched it gently, brushing away the dust. "Hi, little me," he whispered, with a smile, then, quieter still, "Hi, Ethan." Inside the hospital, everything felt different, brighter, warmer. Walls painted in soft colors, art made by children hanging at every corner, and above the reception desk, a phrase glowed in golden letters. "Every child deserves to be found." The receptionist looked up, beaming. "Dr. Wilson Morales, welcome home." Home. The word still made something inside him ache, not with pain, but nostalgia. He smiled. "Thank you. It's good to be back." He was there to open a new wing, one dedicated to early childhood rehabilitation, something he had dreamed of since his own therapy days. But before the ceremony, he wanted a moment alone. He walked down the quiet hallway that led to the memorial wall. Photographs of families reunited, letters from parents who had found hope again, all under the foundation's emblem. And there, near the center, hung a framed picture of his parents, Charles and Eleanor, older now, silver hair glinting in the sun, still hand in hand. They had passed the leadership of the foundation to him 2 years earlier, retiring to a small coastal town where they still woke up early, still tended to flowers, still played the same lullaby on the piano every night. Beneath their photo was a quote written by Charles himself: "Love does not erase pain, it rewrites it." The ceremony began with laughter, cameras and applause, but when Matteo took the stage, the world seemed to slow. He looked at the crowd, doctors, families, children, and for a moment he saw every version of himself reflected in their eyes: the lost boy, the found son, the healer. He took a breath. "I was born twice," he began. "Once in a hospital that lost me, and again in the arms of a woman who refused to let the world forget me." A ripple of emotion passed through the audience. He smiled softly. "The man who became my father taught me that love isn't about where you come from. It's about who shows up when everyone else walks away." He paused, looking toward the ceiling as if someone above might be listening. "I carry 2 names because I carry 2 lives. One ended too soon, one began too late, but both made me who I am." He lifted his gaze again, his voice clear, unwavering. "This new wing is not just a building. It's a promise that no mistake will ever steal a child's chance to be loved again." The applause came slowly at first, then grew into something that felt like thunder, not for fame, but for faith restored. After the ceremony, when everyone had gone, Matteo walked back to the garden. The evening was quiet. Lanterns floated on the small pond, just like the night his parents had made their wish. He knelt beside the roses, closing his eyes. "Mom, Dad, it worked," he whispered. "Your light reached further than you thought." A soft wind brushed his face, gentle, almost human. Somewhere above, a star flickered twice. He smiled, whispering, "Thank you for finding me." As he rose to leave, a small boy ran past. Him, laughing, chasing a paper airplane down the path. Behind him, a woman in a hospital uniform shouted, "Slow down, sweetie, you'll trip." The boy turned and grinned, his dark eyes shining. "It's okay, Mom, I can run now." Matteo froze, just for a second, watching the scene play out like an echo of the past, and he realized the world was still healing, one small miracle at a time. He placed his hand over his heart, feeling 2 beats, his and Ethan's, perfectly in sync. The circle was complete. The sea was calm that morning, a slow, breathing mirror of silver and blue. Waves kissed the shore with a tenderness only time can teach. In a small, white house on the coast, far from the noise of cities and memories of courtrooms, Charles sat by the open window, sunlight warming his aging hands. His hair had turned white, but his eyes, those deep, steady eyes, still carried the quiet fire of a man who had walked through hell and found heaven at the end of it. On the desk before him lay a single sheet of paper and a fountain pen. He had been trying to write for weeks. Today, the words finally came. To my son, Matteo. If you're reading this, it means the tide has already taken me to where your brother waits. Don't be sad. I've lived 2 lives in one. One before love, one after it found me. There will be days when the world feels colder than it should, when people will mistake kindness for weakness, when truth will cost more than silence. On those days, remember this: love is not a candle that burns out. It's the fire that teaches the dark to glow. You carry 2 names, 2 hearts, and 1 story. Ours. Never let the world convince you that being found was luck. It was destiny, written before your first breath. Tell your mother I still hear her lullaby. Tell her I never stopped counting the stars. And tell her I'll save her a seat beside the piano. Dad. He folded the letter carefully, sealing it with a small golden pin shaped like 2 intertwined hearts. Then he looked out to the ocean again, whispering, "Soon, my love." From the next room came the familiar sound of laughter. Elena's voice, older now, still musical, still soft. She entered quietly, wearing a shawl the color of morning sky. "You're writing again?" she asked. He nodded, smiling. "One last song." She sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Then play it for me." He moved to the piano, his fingers trembling only at first. The melody that filled the room was the same one that had followed them through every chapter, slow, golden, eternal. Elena closed her eyes, tears gathering. When the final note faded, she whispered, "You found the heart note again." Charles smiled faintly. It never left. Months later, the mansion on the hill was filled with music once more, but this time it was Matteo at the piano. The ocean roared softly outside as he opened his father's letter. Eleanor sat beside him, her hair silver, her face peaceful. He began to play, not as a child now, but as the man they had raised. Each note shimmered with memory. Each chord carried their laughter, their forgiveness, their love. Halfway through, he paused. His voice was steady when he spoke. "This one's for you, Dad, and for Ethan, for every soul that found light again." Then he continued playing, the song swelling, filling every corner of the house until it seemed the walls themselves were singing. Outside, the sky turned gold, the same gold that had always followed them. And through the window, the sun cast 2 beams of light over the piano. One over him, one over the empty seat beside him. In that glow, it felt like they were all there again. Ethan laughing softly, Charles smiling with pride, Elena humming the lullaby, and Matteo carrying it forward, the last verse of a song that would never truly end. Because some stories don't close, they just keep shining, softly, endlessly, in the people who learn how to love again.